Wow, okay. So, hello everybody. I'm actually overwhelmed to be here. My name is Matthew Reyes, and I have done a lot of different things related to space exploration and empowering other people to be creative when they tell stories about their creations, whether it's hardware, software, or in some cases even films. And so this is actually my third campus party, third one in Brazil. It's my fifth campus party. My first one was in July of 2014 in Recife, and then I think in February the following year in Sao Paulo. And so I'm really excited to be here in Brasilia. It's a beautiful city, and I'm really feeling the vibe. I like the energy that's here. I came in last night and I saw the opening. It's a long flight, but it's a lot of fun. Right now, I'm actually not just working with NASA and GoPro like I used to be, but I'm going to explain in the course of my presentation how all of these things lead together. Today, I'm actually the chair of a conference that we call Dent the Future Space. And the nickname is Dent Space, and in San Francisco. That it is intended to celebrate and present the wide diversity of people, of backgrounds, of gender and race that are actually participating in the exploration of space, in the development of hardware, in the creation of space-related art. I want to be able to have them all come together in the same room so that the inspirations that are shared can then be, well, just like we have here, grown because of collaborations. And so, I also, throughout the part of the year, I produced a live webcast for an event called Burning Man. I'm just curious, anybody here have been to or heard of Burning Man? Okay, a couple. If you've ever seen it on the internet, the live stream of it, that's my production. And then last but not least, I am a freelance consultant and advisor for companies and for individuals who are looking for help on how to, as I was mentioning before, for creativity and in terms of what the product they're developing, the app they're developing, and in some cases even how to market that. So if anybody's interested in talking to me about that, I'm happy to have that conversation. Anything to get me back to Brazil, I do love it here. But before I started working at NASA doing the things I did, I've actually been in the space business for like 17 years. And this is one of the first things that I did when I started in the space business. It was a private company called Zero Gravity Corporation. And what we did, we had an aircraft, it was a 727, that you could fly like a roller coaster in the sky. And as it was going over the top, you could float around like I did, and 35 other passengers were researchers. And so my first job, technically out of college, was trying to figure out how to get the engineering of that aircraft to be good for entertainment, to be good for researchers, to be good for tourism. And so, after I did that job for a couple of years, I moved to California. I moved to Silicon Valley, where it just happens to be a NASA center. It's one of the oldest NASA centers that are there. In case you're not familiar, there are different NASA centers that are distributed across the country. The one you may be more familiar with where they launch the rockets is located in Florida. This is the one on the opposite coast of San Francisco, near where I live now. And after 6 years of working at NASA, helping engineers and students and civil servant government employees spice up their creativity and their innovation, I was recruited by GoPro about 2 years ago. That happened. And then my job at GoPro was amazing because I had to help GoPro work with other companies building spacecraft so that they could use that camera in space, whether it was a satellite or if it was a passenger carrying spacecraft or if it was a robot of some sort. So it was a lot of fun. But then after doing that for a year, I then got to do some really crazy cool stuff with the entertainment side of it, where we were working with the advanced prototype cameras, that some of which are coming out now, that are help film what would be virtual reality, 360-degree spherical video. And so what you'll see in the video there, you barely see it, that's a virtual reality camera in the back. It's a prototype that he helped build. But among the other things we did is we flew high-altitude balloons, getting really close to space. And then we put cameras on a wingsuit jumper over the Great Wall of China. And then we did another trick where we were inside of an underwater space station to help share these experiences with you. If you have a Facebook account, who doesn't have a Facebook account? Everybody's got one. If you want to really cool, if you go to the GoPro video page, if you go to Facebook GoPro videos, you're going to see virtual reality or VR. You'll see a bunch of our work out there. You'll see me smiling.
The talk today is really going to be more about innovation and about how different types of innovation happen and the history of it. Because one of the things that I have found is when I'm working with people, when I was working at NASA or when I work with individuals, is a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this too, a lot of times we think we have a brand new idea. We're the first person to think of this thing. And then only to discover that, well, actually the patent office had a file years and years before, sometimes 20, 30 years for the strangest technology. And we kind of live in this world too. If you look at the movie theater where we have sequels, you know, and we have remakes of the same old movie 2, 3 times, like The Mummy's coming out again. And so it's like, sometimes I feel like we're stuck in a realm of a lack of originality. And so I always like to start these talks and with everybody with a little bit of going back in time, a little bit of history. And so, like, feel the future. It's important for us to remember our history if we're going to have a better feel for what's coming next. So when we're talking about spaceflight and space exploration, some people do argue that the Wright brothers or Albert Santos Dumont were among the first people to reach for the stars when they made their aircraft. You know, in 1903, the Wright brothers made the first airplane to fly under its own power, and that was in the United States in Kitty Hawk. And very closely after, Albert Santos Dumont was doing the same thing, a very different design. In fact, you can see that his design was much more similar to what we see today in aircraft. And so this kind of innovation happening at the turn of the century, in 1903, 1909. And so this is a period of great innovation, a period of scary innovation to a lot of people. I'll argue it's very similar to what we see today when we talk about AI, when we talk about the things that Paco was talking about last night with losing jobs to robots and so forth. And so, and it was particularly scary too because right around 1914 is when World War I started. And so 1903, they're starting to fly airplanes. 1914, World War I starts. You know, in Europe, everybody's really starting to think, how do the aircraft become weapons? How do we use them for defense? And the Brits really were worried about this because in England, it's the island, right? And so they have the greatest navy the world's ever seen, but they had no defense for air because they never had to before. So the Brits in 1909 created their advisory committee, and then the French did it, and the Russians were doing it. But we, the United States, took our time until well into the war to decide that we're going to create an innovation institute, and we called it the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. Okay, and it's similar to NASA in spelling, and you'll understand why in a moment. But the point is that the government started getting involved to support innovation. The government started getting involved to support technology development. And so I see that as similar when we look at our sponsors here today and at other campus parties. It's like we have government support for events like this. And so history has a tendency of repeating itself in good ways as well. 1918, the war ends, and then what happens is that we've built this massive military-industrial complex to build aircraft, and we have all these trained pilots that are starting to come home. And what happens when you mix bored pilots with too many aircraft laying around? they start doing crazy things like the barnstorming era. And so, and that actually was a really interesting time. You can go on YouTube and see these old videos. It's crazy, but what's really crazy is that there were so many planes, and they weren't that good at flying them or flying, that this happened all the time, and people were dying on the ground, and people were, obviously in the aircraft as well. And so the government had to step back in, and in the United States, it was around 1926 or so that they created the Federal Aviation Administration, which was starting to regulate all the safety aspects of this new technology that impacted people. And so today, I see similarities between this and self-driving cars. And I wonder if there's going to be a new administration for the safety and management of self-driving car technologies. And so, but anyway, to continue with the space stuff, it's really important. Oh, actually, just want to highlight that in this time of uncertainty, you know who the president is back home in my country is, we have a lot of strife in how we're governed back home, and I understand here too sometimes. And so the deal here, though, is that the government does have a positive role to play when you get involved. So I just wanted to throw that in there because a lot of times we get real negative about it, myself included if you see me on Twitter. Anyway, back to space. If airplanes were the first technology to try to reach for the stars, people realized that they weren't going to get high enough, and so they had to start relying on a new technology to get them to that extra distance, and that's obviously rocketry. First person to actually develop that technology and use it was widely ridiculed and was told, you're crazy because it's fire, it's coming out of the rocket. And so that was Robert Goddard in 1920. He wrote a paper, and it's called The Method of Reaching of Extreme Altitudes. And so when he finally got around to designing his rocket, he decided he was going to file a patent. And unlike me, nobody else had even come close to filing a patent like that. He got his in 1914, but it took him 12 more years to actually build and launch the rocket. And he did so on the east coast of the States. But at the same time in Germany, Hermann Oberth was actually taking it a step forward and saying that technology is what's going to get us off the planet, but then onto the moon, and then onward to other planets like Mars. And so these kinds of actual technological thoughts where they were putting diagrams. In fact, you can see Oberth is holding hardware in his hand. They were really coming to fruition at that moment in time for the first time ever. But I also kind of like to take a step back further in history and say, well, wait a minute. They were building the first things to go to space, but what about the people who were building the first things to bring space to us? I argue that Galileo certainly could be one of the first space explorers. He is credited sometimes, it depends on where you read it, that he invented the telescope, but in fact, he actually hacked a telescope. He modified a telescope that he saw somebody else make. It was a spyglass for looking at the horizon, as it was called. And he hacked it and hand-polished his own lenses so that he could turn around and aim it at the sky. And one of the first things that he looked at, first thing he looked at was the moon, and he discovered that the moon is not perfectly smooth. And so that was a huge surprise to everybody. And even though when I look at it, it doesn't look smooth, but that's okay. But then the other thing he discovered, and as you know, probably is that he discovered the moon's around Jupiter, and that Jupiter's a planet, and it goes around the sun, and everybody's going crazy. But he actually, and actually, just a funny side story, this is what he drew in his book. That's actually his handwriting in his book, and I happen to have caught that with my fancy camera, no telescope, the same configuration of the planets of Jupiter. And so the fact that we're used to that as normal, and this was like, oh, a big innovation to him. He deserves much more credit than I would say the rocketry or the early aviators for reaching towards space. But then you have to kind of take a step back and wonder, what about the observatories that were built 1,000 years ago? In doing research for this talk, I don't know, how many, I'm going to see if I can say this right. Kalsoyeni? Did I say it right? Maybe not. Okay. This is a Stonehenge in northern Brazil. How many people have seen this before or heard of this before? Oh, not too many. Yeah, this is pretty cool. What they did is it's about 1,000 years ago, they put these rocks in a place so that when the sun, at the winter solstice, the sun will pass right through the stone. And so they had a deep connection to things that were in outer space, even if they didn't fully understand at the time, they were building hardware and doing the mathematics and the engineering that it took to actually explore space. Okay? Same with the Greeks. Well before that. In fact, it was fun to kind of look at the dating of the Brazilian Stonehenge, as it's called. It's actually pretty early. It beat the Chinese and the Turks and some of the bigger structures around the world that were dedicated to, as I say, space exploration. But another thing I want to tie in here too is that these were not ventures that were alone. They were also with massive groups of people and frequently state-sponsored. And so now the history of observatories is a little bit different. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but what really is interesting to pay attention to is that the early observatories were used to understand tactics for farming and sometimes for attacking or for understanding defense of potential invaders. And so it's one of these things where there's this dual nature of the technology, which we saw also with rocketry. And to go back to Robert Goddard, that's actually the rocket right there in the middle. The launch pad, if you will, is the triangle. And that's his patent drawing. No computers at the time. and so, you know, he launched this in, was it 1914? He made the patent. 1926, it finally launched. And it was, yeah, you know, okay. But then it wasn't until the Germans figured out how to really launch these rockets. And in 1942 is when they launched the first ones with success. And then unfortunately in 1944 is when they used them as a full-on weapon. And so one of the lessons that I want to really kind of press forward here is that as we look forward to developing technology, when we're looking at space technology, we must remember that a lot of the technology we have is rooted in defense and sometimes even offense in warfare. It's important that when we're thinking of making new technologies, that we are paying attention to what the potential negatives are. In the United States, there are very strict laws about how you can make certain kinds of technologies like guidance systems. And I'll get into this. A guidance system for a missile is not much different than a guidance system for a drone. And so it's an interesting time where all of these mathematics are starting to become easier and easier, and we'll get into what that means in a minute. But the real critical point is that if we are understanding of what the true nature of the technology is and focus on keeping it positive and understanding, and then more importantly, working with our governments to make sure it's regulated properly, then I think we have a better hope than just randomly letting things fly. Speaking about more flying, you know, Sputnik, everybody knows, 1957, the Russians launched it. It was the first one up there. It was actually a science experiment. It wasn't a weapon. It was just a radio, a battery, and the aluminum ball itself was pressurized with nitrogen. And so they were trying to measure the difference in pressure in that altitude that it was flying in space versus the ground. And so it was an interesting little sensor they built. But of course, that scared the Americans. And a few months later, they built Explorer 1. With our, let's see, again, our favorite German rocket engineer, Werner von Braun, and launched it shortly thereafter. It was basically the same thing as Sputnik. It was a radio with a battery and a couple antennas on it. President Eisenhower in 1958, though, President Eisenhower was a general in World War II who, you know, won the war basically, and was very worried about the development of the military-industrial complex. He saw it that it was a threat to democracy and it was a threat to the world because there's a potential for profit, you know, in building these weapons. And so he decided that he was not going to start a fight, a war in space with the Russians, and that he was going to create NASA from the NACA. So the Aviation Aeronautics Council was converted in 1958 into NASA. And the reason why I like to highlight this is because where I worked at NASA Ames in Silicon Valley, that was one of the first NACA centers. NACA centers. It was definitely in the first group of the NASA centers. And so it's a place steeped in old history, and it is one of the driving reasons why I like to bring up history. And so, and speaking of history, we kind of know what happened next after NASA. First man, after we followed the Soviets at the time. At first, they had the first man, the first animal, the first woman, first everything, pretty much, except we got the first to the moon. And so it's kind of interesting how all of those big firsts that they got kind of pale in comparison to the fact that we had men on the moon. So, but what's really interesting, too, about the politics of this space program was that the Saturn V, they made a lot of these things. And they were just sitting there, and they were getting expensive to launch. And so what the government decided, it was President Johnson and President Nixon, decided it was too expensive to launch these things, so the moon is boring, we've been there already, so they stopped. And this is where the stories really get interesting. What do you do when you have these Saturn V sitting around that you bought and paid for? You should fly them, but you're not going to be able to spend all the money to go to the moon. They decided they were going to make a space station. So they hacked together a space station. It was the largest space station ever out of old rocket parts. And let's see. I don't know if you can see my laser, but here. This is a rocket. This is a silhouette of a rocket that goes to the moon. The lander goes in the bottom of the triangle, and the people go on the top of the triangle. And the rest of it is a gas tank, if you will. So in order to make the space station, they figured they were going to hack the gas tank and make that a habitable area where that's where they would live. And that's in the middle picture with that the cylinder in the middle. And then they figured they would hack the launch pad so that they could fit a smaller rocket so that they could go back to, up to the space station. And so there's a lot of hacking going on to make this actually work. And I don't know, how many people, raise your hand if you consider yourself a hacker. A couple. Oh, okay. So I would have thought more, but that's okay. So if you're a hacker, I consider myself a hacker. Maybe it's a language thing. So someone who's always tinkering and always making hardware. I tend to be breaking a lot of things, and in fact, that's what happened with the space station. Is that the Skylab space station was when they launched it, the heat shield on it broke off, and so they had to employ these really talented hackers, these really talented seamstresses, to actually make a blanket, a parasol. Okay, and that's what they did. Is that that could be my grandmother. It could be your great grandmother. Working there, putting together basically potato chip bags, like Doritos bags, together. Not the same, obviously, but the reflective material to make a parasol, an umbrella that would go over the damaged portion of the space station to shade it from the sun. And this is actually a photograph of that. And this was a crazy time because it was getting so hot in there, they could not stay in there. So they had to leave the station, come back to the ground, build the parasol, and then very quickly pop it out. And so, I don't know how many work with old cars, because I work with old cars and old motorcycles, and it's like I'm always tinkering with them. And so I think of like having been on the side of the road with broken down, and I'm like, gosh, that's a little different, but not much. But what's really funny about the advanced technology that they use to fix the space station was a sewing machine. It's like the understanding of how to use what is actually one of the most popular advanced manufacturing machines in the history of the world. Is they use this, and what's really interesting when you stop to understand the current state of technology, I want to know how many people have seen this before. If you know how to sew, oh no, I want you not this. Raise your hand if you've seen this before. That's a soft robot. Okay, that's a robot that has no hard metal parts to it. It is completely sewn together, and it's operating by air. Those orange hoses are operating the hand and the bicep, the muscle, and lifting that full bucket of sand. Okay, and so if you know how to sew, you're halfway to making a robot. Isn't that a weird thing? I would never have thought that before. I mean, I like fashion, but I never robots. That's cool. But then it gets even crazier. How many have seen this before? That's an inflatable space station. Okay, that is a big bag that is strong enough to hold the atmosphere for astronauts to float around in. It was built in Nevada near Las Vegas in the United States. And this actually was deployed, launched to the International Space Station and installed. It works. And even before they launched to the International Space Station, they launched separate spacecraft that were independent balloons that are strong enough to hold the temperature, hold the temperature, but the pressure, but then also potential meteor impacts, because there's, that happens too. It's interesting how much better softer materials fare in space than metals and harder. They're much more forgiving. So to kind of change gears a little bit, one of the things about this technology was you're seeing with inflatables is that you can actually collapse, like origami, a large volume into a small space, okay? This is a really important thing in space, but it's also important everywhere if you think about how we transport things right now. If you have a large volume thing, if something takes up a lot of space but doesn't weigh very much, you're still taking a truck to move it. And so there are these issues where it's good to be able to assemble things that can be packed down. And so you'll see the connection here. At Burning Man, one of the things that we do is we build a city in the middle of a desert. And we have to transport these things. And the thing that we did is we look at old Japanese-style architecture where wood, or carpentry, where wood pieces just interlock and fit together. Okay? Now, how does this relate to space? You'll see in a second. But we built this entire temple. I mean, you can see how tall the person is there. Okay? Out of interlocking pieces with no fasteners. So one of the things that I just found out is there's not an IKEA in Brazil. Is there? Okay, but you know what IKEA is? Okay, cool. All right, because somebody didn't know, and I was like, really? So IKEA, IKEA furniture, you put it together, lots of fasteners there. But what's really interesting too is that much of their work is about fitting it so that it'll fit in your car. So designing all the pieces so they fit in a box so they can be easily shipped. And so this is a kind of design thinking that is critically important when you're looking at designing spacecraft and should be applied to pretty much anything that as makers we want to make, especially if you want to make things portable. Okay? And so I like space. I like Burning Man. A friend of mine wanted to build an observatory at Burning Man, and I'm like, sure, let's do it. And so what we did is we had the gentleman who built the temple, or designed the temple. He went ahead and designed us an observatory. And we needed the money to do it, because I don't have that much money laying around. But we went to Kickstarter and we raised it, and it was really good. And I'm going to get into the importance of Kickstarter for this in a second. But here's how we did it. All that plywood was actually carved out on an end mill. This one's called a shop bot, but has anybody ever used or seen a 3-axis mill like this before? Anybody do woodworking? Okay, cool, a couple. So that's a robot that is just following the traces of a line that somebody programmed on the computer. That's all. And with the material that's being fed in, you get these individual pieces for the structure that you can then ship easily in a trailer and then assemble something that is much larger than the truck that towed the trailer. And by hand, you don't need cranes. And so the moral of the story is that it's important to kind of think of structures and think of design in ways that you can actually make them collapsible. You don't need to worry about fasteners, because where'd that screw or that screwdriver go? And then more importantly, they can be repaired, because you think about it in terms of modularity. And so where we're getting back into space is that all space stations are built and designed to be modular. And so the inflatable one, the hard one, all of these things, it's not a far leap when you're looking at the modularity of some of these fancy structures like this. This one's in Spain, versus in the modularity of space stations. Interesting update to this is that I saw in the news that IKEA was just in the news because they are now sending their engineers to go to these Martian, with their analog space stations. They're test beds in the middle of the Utah desert, and you stay inside that as if you were inside of a spaceship. Okay? And then anytime you want to walk out, you're walking out with a spacesuit on. And every time you come in, you got to go through the pain of taking it off. And so point is that you have these engineers at IKEA that are now trying to pay more attention to really tight spaces. And so when they open an IKEA here, maybe you'll be, the first IKEA will be the Martian IKEA. So 3D printers. Who hasn't seen a 3D printer? Has not seen a 3D printer. Okay, that was a trick. All right, so 3D printing everybody knows about. Now imagine, as I was saying before, folding materials. Okay, folding materials are fit inside excuse me. If you can fold up soft materials, and then if you can build up hard materials, then you can also have the 3D printers with the filament can build larger materials too. And so I worked with a group that actually built the first 3D printer in the International Space Station. And so let's see here. Okay, and this is actually a video from inside that 3D printer. So the fun story about this is that these were students that I had in my program to be able to develop. I'm sorry. My students were in a program when I was working on this airplane to develop technology that worked in microgravity, and these are them floating around inside my old plane. 20-year-olds hacked the printer, got it sold to the to NASA, and put it on the International Space Station. And so one of the things that I really want to highlight too, though, it's not going to just be just 3D printers. Even though, Paco, I wanted to put this in there. We did have a 3D printing effort to print lunar materials so we could print bases on the moon. But, and actually, that other video that you saw, that tower that was growing, is trusses like these can be printed and then assembled robotically. And so that's the new way forward. It's like it's not just going to be this traditional 3D printing method. It's going to be 3D printing and assembly. And so I challenge you to think along those lines of how can you combine 3D printing with other methods of assembly. All right, let me skip that. So one of the first spacecrafts I helped actually work on at NASA with some students, building it out of Legos, and then eventually cell phones. And so a team that I worked with actually stopped to take a think. Oh, I don't have my phone. Stopped to think about the reality that phones have enough sensors in them to be able to fly a spacecraft. And remember I was telling you earlier about government concerns about spacecraft and guidance systems? Well, as it turns out, phones are strong enough now to navigate to navigate spacecraft. And so let me just show you a nice little video here if it loads up. Here we go. Let's see, the audio is on this one. Okay, so what we're seeing, I'll just narrate it. We put a cell phone inside of a rocket. As you can see, it just launched. That's actually the video from the cell phone camera. And what you're seeing at the bottom of this chart are the accelerometers, the X, Y, and Z accelerometers of the phone, telling the phone exactly its position in space. So phones have the accelerometers, they have a radio, they have GPS, they have cameras. Man, they're almost a satellite on their own. And so this is the first flight of the prototype phone sat that was built. And so one thing that we learned is that it's better to have professionals build your rockets because sometimes the parachutes don't always work and they end up burying in the ground. But to get really to the point here is that the group of students and researchers who built the phone sat, some of them are kids, they're definitely 10 years younger than me, and my peers left NASA to start their own company. And they created the company is called Planet Labs. And they are the largest manufacturers of satellites in the history of satellite making. They make more satellites in a week than have ever been made before. And they're going to be flying them at tens to hundreds at a time. And that's the actual size of the satellite. You can see it's a telescope. And one of the cool things, I'll show a quick video. This is how they're actually launched. You put them inside of basically a suitcase. You send it to this International Space Station. Then the astronauts will load it into this spring-loaded shooting mechanism. And then they start flying. Now, this video shows how they're tumbling. They actually can recover. But I want to highlight something. These satellites, okay, these were hand-built by people not much different. You know, I built one. And so I'll show you this satellite took pictures of the fleet of satellites, I should say, because they have so many up there, have taken several pictures above Brazil and are showing in a daily manner, taking pictures of the planet so that we can see how the Earth changes. And then so, and just here's some cool pictures that I found in Brazil. Now, smaller is better. And so we worked right after we did PhoneSat, or a few years after PhoneSat, we decided that we were going to go back to the drawing board and find out how we can make things even better with off-the-shelf technology. And so Zach Manchester was a student at Cornell University, and he helped develop these little chips that are about that big. And so designing circuit boards is different than many of the other manufacturing methods, but I just want to highlight that that itself is the spacecraft. They get put into that box that he was holding in his hand, and then they're flung out into space. And then once they're out there, all you need to have is an antenna that you can hold with your hand to listen to it. And so if you're interested in developing spacecraft, these are skills that exist on the ground. They're easy to do. They involve app programming. They involve circuit design. They involve ham radio and amateur radio. These they seem to be out of reach sometimes, but in fact, these are incremental steps that I didn't know how to do any of this before until I started actually practicing and working on it. And so let me, the key thing here is that collaboration is going to be key, because nobody knows all the skills to make these things work. The first collaborative satellite, a lot of times people were thinking that the Kickstarter was the first time that people were crowdfunding. You know, people were joining forces to pay for things, but in fact, the first crowdfunded satellite was what, in 1962. It cost $18,000 in 1962, which today is $136,000. Kickstarters today, the $136,000 can totally buy you a satellite, okay? And with enough people sitting together throwing in $1, it's an achievable goal. And this is what's happened. There have been a number of these satellites that have been built and then pitched onto Kickstarter. There are at least 17 different satellites that have flown, or to be flown, that have been fully funded on Kickstarter. In fact, let me cut to that. Ooh, okay. If you look at the analysis of all the Kickstarters out there, here's the thing. This blew my mind, and this actually makes it really exciting. What is it? 2.2. Everybody asked for $2.2 million. They received over $1.8 million more money than they asked for across all of these Kickstarter campaigns, and these here are in the millions. That's 1.6 million at the top. If you see the red bar is how much extra they wanted or they got. So there is this enthusiasm out there for people to help build these things and make these things happen. And so it's important to know how to communicate your vision and be able to bring the group together if you want to do this. And this is the proof. It's totally doable. And some of these, one of them is, I don't know if you can see on there, but it's the first Costa Rican satellite. They got a little bit extra money globally because people were excited to see Costa Rica do this. And so it's fascinating use of the technology, of crowd sharing money, which technology. But to also look back to when I was talking about sewing, somebody actually made a Kickstarter and was fully funded to do a spacesuit. It's not like they're going to be wearing it on a spacecraft anytime soon, but people are interested in seeing it happen. And one of the extra things that I really like to highlight about this is that Ted right here, Ted Southern is his name, he actually participated in a NASA government program that put a challenge out. And it said, look, astronaut gloves suck. They're painful. They cause blisters, and the astronauts, when they're working in outer space, they're fighting that pressure. Can somebody out there make a better glove? As it turns out, Ted actually made the wings for Victoria's Secret on the runway, and he was the third place winner for the NASA Centennial Challenge. And so if anybody works with the government here, there are examples after example where the government, small amounts of government money can be set aside to inspire and incentivize people to solve really big problems. And so it's an interesting way. NASA has had several examples of this, and if anybody's interested, I can share more. And so just to kind of nail my points here is that everything we're talking about doing when it comes to space exploration, it has an old history of individual people in times where technology was not accessible, just taking a step forward to make that change, okay? And we're seeing the same thing today. The talent exists in this room to make the next satellite or the next spacecraft innovation that NASA hasn't even thought of, okay? And so that's what I think is important to really take home, is that if you think big and work together, you'll be able to achieve that dream. And then the other thing I really want to highlight too, and this is something I skipped through, going a little fast there, but everything that you do, that you dream about, working in space, things, making it smaller, making it sustainable, lower power, clean water, all of these things have direct application here on Earth, here in our backyards. And so it's not a fool's errand to actually want to explore space and develop technology to do it, because you can actually commercialize it or give it away in ways that help the planet and help our neighbors. And so I want people to think about space exploration that way, as something that is not this unachievable dream, but that is something that is very easily in your pocket. And so with that, I thank you. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, I'm going to be here tomorrow too, but you can find me online. I'm known as Motorbike Matt on the internet, so follow me if you like, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you. Thank you. Oh, so I think there's what, 4 or 5 minutes for a question? Okay, so let me put on my universal translator. Oh, and real quick, if I got anything wrong in the Portuguese on the slides, it's Google Translate's fault. I don't know any Portuguese other than, obrigado. So, okay. Who has a question? I can. Okay, oh, there's one over there.
Bom dia, né? Boa tarde. Parabéns pela apresentação. Quando você mostrou os preços dos CubeSats, esse preço já está incluso o do lançamento? E como foram feitos esses lançamentos? Foi por empresa privada e se foram pela ISS mesmo?
Oh, okay. So, if I understand correctly, all of the CubeSats, let me turn this down. All of the CubeSats that I showed were all from the suitcase method into the International Space Station with an astronaut, and then in the spring loader. It's a company called Nanoracks, and that's actually something important to say, is that Nanoracks makes money by providing a service, and so it's a profitable service for them. So does that answer your question? Or? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Do crowdfunding já tinha o preço incluso do lançamento ou não?
Oh, I see. So that's a good question. The answer is that they thought it was. In many cases, they were using the money in the crowdfunding because they already had a ride because of NASA or because of some other program. There are other examples, though, where they didn't expect it to be so much money, which is the story of Kickstarter. A lot of people create these crowdfundings without realizing what the true costs are. So, yeah.
Okay, so how are we on the regulation step of putting on the sky, stuff like that, because I imagine that if anyone can get a phone set like that and can pay for putting it in space, how can I be sure that no one's gonna be watching my home or something like that?
No, that's a very good question. In fact, there is an international treaty that requires anybody who builds a satellite that has a camera on it has to have an obstacle. They have to have a $1 million bond check written to the government saying that you have to have the systems in place to obey these international laws. And so Planet Labs had that trouble when they had to come up with the money, but in Silicon Valley, they had venture capital funding to be able to cover those bills easily. So, but that is one of the big barriers, and it's a global thing. Every country has a different method, but they have to put up a lot of money, and that's going to prevent me from doing that. So yeah, so cameras come with that. Done? Okay. Thank you again, everybody. Oh yeah.